Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called Waxwork. So, I believe this movie might actually be like a remade film because there is this black and white film called Waxworks that I think this movie does like copy and paste a lot from or get a lot of ideas from. So, letting you know, everybody, if you want to go ahead and check this out, maybe after hearing what I have to say about it, go ahead and check this movie on Tubi. Tubi, it's a free movie and TV service. At the end of the day, you could see this film and a cluster of others. So, really, I would say that this movie has, in a roundabout way, like the kitchen sink of horror kind of approach to it, where you not only have like werewolves, you have vampires, Dracula, the Mummy, like every bit of like universal monster kind of approach in this film, and more. Like little like baby creatures or aliens, so on and so forth. But it all depends on like how much like they're actually into this film. I had a fun ride watching this. This was like a real fun adventure of a film. Like it's kind of weird how like whenever I'd use the word like adventure before, I would just be like, yeah, like this is like a sucky word to me, so I'm going to use the word adventure. But it seems like I've grown to like turn that word around and just say like, yeah, cool, adventure. Like so, but that's what this movie is. So yeah, like this like is one of those kind of variety kind of movies where you have like these little small stories within one big setting of a thing. And so now I'm gonna have to like try to explain that. So what ends up happening is there is like that old kind of fashion story where you have one house on the block that is to be a seemingly haunted house, but in this case, it is to actually be some wax museum. And so, interestingly enough, we have one spot in this movie where there's one girl whose boyfriend is asking her, "Hey, do you want to go to the movies tonight?" And this girl is just like, "No, I'm just too tired." But I guess not tired enough to walk around aimlessly into a wax museum for who knows how long. Like, I guess she's not tired for that, but to each their own, I guess. So we go into this film, and all of a sudden we have people who I guess, like, have certain kind of scenarios, like, picked out for them, where all of a sudden they are just so intrigued by these certain scenes and or pieces to the point of them going ahead and deciding one way or another for some reason that they want to kind of get a little closer to the pieces for some reason or another, which leads them all of a sudden into the world of which that they have decided to pick, basically. So all of a sudden, like for example, if someone is to all of a sudden go and walk a little bit closer onto a set of a zombie story, all of a sudden they become this character, and like their clothes drastically change, their look drastically changes, and so all of a sudden they are a character infused into this story, and now they have to play things out. Whether they are going to live through this or die through this, that is really just their decision. And eventually we find out Mark's character, who of course a lot of people will know from like Gremlins, because I've seen that this past Halloween. Like we have Mark, who is to seemingly at first be this douchebag of a man, but then eventually we turn around and have him eventually become the hero of this story, and he starts to figure things out that no one else could have. And so then all of a sudden we eventually have Mark, who is technically tied to the waxwork man, who is to be like the Willy Wonka of this story, who's like come and have a few paradise, simply go around. Like he looks like he has that kind of attire on him, or he has that kind of appeal to him, where like it feels like this guy is going to be like a Willy Wonka kind of character. And but yeah, like this kind of breaks down as like this bizarrish like Willy Wonka of a thing, and all of a sudden you see these like eventually like towards the end of the movie, every single one of these wax characters eventually come to life. But also, when you have all these people kind of walking through this whole thing, you can honestly see that like a lot of these characters are trying to pause and hold their pause for a very long period of time. You could tell that these aren't actual wax statues of any of these characters, that they're actually just holding these poses, which, man, that has got to be extremely difficult to try to pull off. And I really do appreciate any of those people that had to go through this scene and just like doing that for who knows how long of a moment. So that way all the people can walk in and all the people could be able to do this scene and then like yell cut and just be like, okay, like so and so place, relax, because now we're going into this piece and that piece and whatever. And but yeah, but eventually this all breaks down into like a lynch mob of a place where like it's basically humans against these wax figures that come to life. It kind of becomes like a night in the museum kind of thing, but in a very horrific kind of way. Like this isn't a movie that is just gonna be like, oh yeah, this is fun, tra la 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 la. No, eventually we're going to see some monstrous characters. Like there's a werewolf in this movie that I think is kind of presented kind of fun. Like I don't think that this movie is hugely scary. I just think that this movie is fun to watch, and really some people might just have fun watching this kind of way of doing things. It does feel like an old-fashioned movie. It also does kind of at some points kind of feel like people are acting goofingly, just because there's some performances where I'm like, okay, this just seems like I'm just like having a hard time buying it. But I'm like, yeah, like this movie overall is just a fun film, and I really did enjoy it. So with that said, I think it's about that time to break things down. If anything, I'm probably at some point in time probably going to have difficulties probably remembering every certain character's name. And so more than likely, I might go into a severe generic sense at some point in time with certain characters' names because I might not remember everything. So with that said, I'm going to go out of my way to say that I've seen this movie because technically I have. And let's go out of our way to say that we've seen this. Let's go out of our way to say it's about that coveted time again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of this film, we have Mark, who is to eventually go and sit next to his mother at this very long stretch of table that has this gigantic thing of a flower, like, separating them. Like, it kind of feels like the Batman 89 scene between Bruce and the woman that he's with in the first movie, and where they're like, while they're eating their soup, and like Bruce is just like, yeah, I don't think I've ever been in this room before. Like, do you want to leave? Yeah, like it kind of feels like that kind of scene. So anything, it seems like Mark's mother is talking about like his like what he should be eating and stuff like that. And Mark is just like, well, I need my caffeine. Like, I need my caffeine. And so we end up just having Mark leaving the table without having any kind of real true breakfast whatsoever. But so he leaves the room, and his handler, which I think is Jenkins, eventually gives him, I guess, coffee and gives him a cigarette. I'm like, how old is this guy? Like, is he supposed to be like a senior of high school? Like, how old is he? Because he honestly looks a little bit older than who he should probably be playing, in all honesty. But hey, man, like, everybody got bills to pay, so like, everybody has to look a certain age, which I'm sure they're probably way older than they actually should be doing this, but whatever. So going into this, so what ends up happening is two girls, one of them I believe is China, all of a sudden is to be walking by a waxworks that seems to be in just a like a normal area in a part of a residential place, which seems really odd. It's like all of a sudden you have like the burbs, or like the normal like burb setup where all of a sudden you just have like Tom Hanks and so and so people, like everybody is just kind of just uh like there's a bunch of normal houses, and then all of a sudden there's just a waxwork that just pops up in the middle of it somewhere bizarrely. So all of a sudden China and this other friend of hers is going to see this waxwork, and like, okay, this seems kind of weird, but if anything, like, nah, let's like maybe like we should see like what this place is about. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, we just have this waxwork man worker who a lot of people will know from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 as the scientist, who is to be like fall walking talking turtles. And he's, of course, yeah, the scientist guy from, and he's done a lot of voiceover work too. But anyways, so we see this waxwork man who is to like tell the girls like, hey, like if you want to come by tonight, like we would gladly take you guys in, because I guess like this waxwork doesn't open until a certain time at night. And we also had this waxwork man who is telling them that they need to bring like 6 people in total to come to this waxwork place. And so they're like, okay, like we should probably have enough friends for that, probably. So, but also like China is just kind of like mentioning to him, it's like, what, do you guys think that you're going to get heavily busy? And the guy is just like, no, just bring 6 with you, because there's a whole reason for that. It seems like one of those where they need a specific number to like unleash these waxwork beings upon the earth, and so they need a specific number of souls that are to be dead to eventually unleash the waxworks upon people. So I guess that's the whole scheme of things. So China and her friend are to go to school, and bizarrely we have this one teacher who is to be lecturing these students, and he bizarrely has like a lot of Nazi memorabilia, and like he like talks about Mein Kampf in this movie, and I'm like, okay, I don't know why, like I don't know what it is that they kept drilling into people about this whole guy who really just bizarrely is to consistently talk about this stuff, and I didn't understand why. But eventually we have Mark who is to interrupt this class, and so we have forcibly the lecturer who's telling Mark that he needs to do some paper of things of whatever that they were talking about. So Mark ends up just like sponging off his homework to, I think, his like maid or one of the people working under him. And eventually Mark is to go and like look at the paper and read it off, and he's like, oh my god, like this doesn't even like this seems like gibberish. Like this seems like a person who barely like this woman is doing this paper for him, and it's just like, yeah, like I think people are bad, and like and it's just like, oh my god, he's reading it off, and he's just like, god, I should just throw this away. There's no way I'm going to be able to get any passing grade off of this. But I guess supposedly the lecturer or the teacher is to like, there are some bizarrish dealings eventually we get later where like there's to be like a certain number of evil people in the world, I guess, but we'll push on to that. So we'll push on to that later. So eventually, like, these people who are all kind of watching football practice, and one of the jock guys, who I guess is a star, who I guess is to be Steven, is to eventually ask China, "Hey, do you want to go to a movie tonight?" And China is like, "No, I'm really not wanting to do that." But that just sets us up to eventually have Steven make his way to this waxwork as well, because eventually he ends up calling to find if China's home, and he ends up finding out exactly where she had went eventually. So, which leads him to head there and head his way into eventually going into one of these pieces, let's just say. So eventually this setup is to have all these 6 people that are on that are basically on watching as this football practice to go on. All these 6 people are eventually going to head to this waxworks. So once they all start heading there, all of a sudden we immediately have people that are all of a sudden to start to get creeped out just by the outside of this building. I'm like, huh? I'm like, really? So we all of a sudden have 2 people who end up chickening out, and they're like, dude, I'm not going through here. And so we have these 4 people head into the waxworks, and so now we have a guy named Hans, who is to be like the opener of this door. It also seems that we have like another like butler of sorts that looks much more taller and is much more of a lurch kind of character, which I guess from time to time helps out through here. So anyways, we have all these people go in, and Hans is just like, I thought we would have more, meaning that he thought that they would have the 6 number that they would have, but they didn't. So all of a sudden we have these people go in there, and like, because like we have Mark, who's all of a sudden like lighting another cigarette, because if he hasn't done that enough in this movie. But we transition them to go into this spot where we see every single scenario all at once of all of these things. Like we see like an alien who's at this like a mutant snake creature, I guess, attacking this one like Carney, I guess, and we see a werewolf scenario, we see a vampire scenario, we see a mummy scenario. We see all kinds of different like scenarios being played out here. Most of which we won't get to because we just don't have the time. But they're just kind of used as like the big hoopla thing at the end here. So what ends up happening eventually is that the waxworkman is basically just like, here you go, like go and check this all out. So the very first person who ends up getting sucked into this like whole roll of things, because what ends up happening is we end up having a guy named Tony, who is to all of a sudden go and try to light up his cigarette, and all of a sudden he accidentally flings his lighter into this one werewolf set piece. And so he's like, well, I should probably easily be able to just grab my lighter and just back away, hopefully not wrecking anything. So Tony goes in, and all of a sudden he gets sucked into this werewolf story, and so all of a sudden he is to be this completely different like looking man. He has long hair, and like he has different clothes, and he is to be called some other character. And so all of a sudden we have this guy who goes into this like cabin of sorts, to all of a sudden have the guy who a lot of people might know from like Lord of the Rings, who is John Rhys-Davies, who is seemingly telling Tony, hey, like, the full moon has struck, and like I think that I will be changing soon. And Tony is just like, hey man, like let's just cool out. You know what? Like, how about I go and get some logs and like, we can just go and just chill, you know? Like, we can just relax. This is the 80s, so I don't think they say much of this lingo, but, like, I'm paraphrasing, obviously. So, Tony is to go out and just get some logs and just be like, you know what I think? Like did I hallucinate? Like what is this? Like why is it that I'm like dreaming like about this? Like shouldn't I hallucinate about like me being at a beautiful beach with a woman? Like why am I stuck in this horror scenario? This makes no sense. So like to me bizarrely like I was like thinking of my mind of this feeling like a quantum leap like scenario that all of a sudden like Al is gonna pop out and uh and all of a sudden have to help Tony like figure out like what's going on and help save him. If anybody has seen Quantum Leap, because like you're a person like I have that remembers that show, good God for you. Like thank you for knowing Quantum Leap. But anyways, so Tony is to go back into this cabin, and now uh, we have man who is now changed into werewolf, and so all of a sudden we have this werewolf that is attacking, of course, Tony and like slicing his arm. All of a sudden we have a werewolf hunter and his like protege coming in, and so this werewolf ends up crushing this one guy's head, but then the older werewolf hunter goes and shoots down the werewolf, and the werewolf ends up like going back and sitting back in this chair and kind of looking at Tony. And so all of a sudden we have Tony who is starting to change into this werewolf. And so we have the werewolf hunter that is going and having to forcibly shoot Tony, and so now Tony is dead. So basically, for these scenarios, it's basically try as much as humanly possible to avoid to die. But eventually, Mark is to eventually come up with the key ingredient to these things, is to like basically like if you don't want to die, like basically have your mind allow you to not die. Like basically like this is all in your head, and basically if you think that you will not die here, you will not get shot. It's something like that, where it's like you basically become invincible in every one of these scenarios if you just think in your head that you're not going to. So basically this place kind of relies a lot on fear, and so like that's kind of the whole thing of it. So pushing on to yet another story. So China. China eventually is to head into a scenario that seems kind of very God, what would be the word? Like old fashioned kind of like Mozart like kind of times, like when like Beethoven and Mozart was kind of like around like in huge amount of centuries ago and whatever, where like we basically just have like doth mother know you with your drapes, like kind of that kind of like kind of like old fashioned Hamlet Shakespearean kind of periods and whichever. So China is to get sucked into this scenario where all of a sudden she is going to be eating with a bunch of people, and so China is to all of a sudden supposed to chow down on this food that seems to be laced with a certain kind of thing. So China is to all of a sudden open up her food and supposedly get a special sauce getting put with it. And so she realizes that this food looks freaking disgusting. But all these other people are just gobbling it all up. And so the one main male figure is to actually be Count Dracula, and every single one of these characters are to supposedly be vampires. Every one of these vampires are to eventually just start gnawing away on their food, and I'm just like, ew! You loving that man witch, lady? That man witch? Because eventually China is to eventually go and kind of leave for the night because she's like, yeah, I think I'm gonna be sick, kind of thing. So China ends up leaving and kind of like starts to like head around this castle, eventually going down this spot where all of a sudden we are to see a man who had been held prisoner and had a huge chunk being taken out of his leg. And so this guy is being basically tortured and and uh, and eaten alive. And so China is trying to just be like, is this some kind of joke? Is this some kind of like play? This is insane because every one of these people, like, they have a role to play, but they're all just like their actual selves. They're not all of a sudden just like a completely different person altogether. They're just like, what the heck is this? Like, this makes no sense to me. So China is to try to figure out how to rescue this man, but eventually one of the male vampires are to appear that isn't Count Dracula. And so all of a sudden China is to need to defend herself against this thing by putting together these knives to form this cross and press this cross against this man's head. And so China has to also go and stab this character into the heart. And so the man is telling her to break this chair and be able to use it as a device to like stab people with. But here's the thing, a lot of times she just uses it as like a bat, and you could tell like the very like once she first breaks this thing off, there's a sharp point to it, but then eventually once they like go back, all of a sudden like the point of it is like broken off. So it's like, yeah, I don't think you're gonna be stabbing anybody all quite that easily right now, but whatever. So all of a sudden we have these 3 female vampires that are all to appear, and so China is just defending herself, freaking stabbing all these women, and I'm just like, yeah, you go, China. China is taking all these women out, and so eventually China just runs away from this spot, but eventually she ends up coming prey to Count Dracula. That eventually Count Dracula is kind of like, look into my eyes. I'm going to you, and you're gonna die. Like, so, yeah, because I'm freaking Dracula. And so, like, China's like, well, yeah, I guess he is Dracula. I should probably die now. So, because you just see, like, China and Dracula on this stairwell, and, like, Dracula is just like, I'm just gonna, like, suck the blood out of you, and you're gonna die, sadly enough. But, I guess eventually in the actual end of this, like, we technically have a lot of these people we eventually have all these people eventually die, but they kind of come back at the end to just kind of like forward off Mark at some points and just kind of have them all be like the villains of this story now, because they made the mistake of just being like, well, I guess I'm gonna die because what else am I gonna do? So what ends up happening is that 2 people are to die, and so there's only 2 left. There's Sarah and there is Mark, who are to be left. And so we have Sarah, who is just kind of like fixed on this one scene, and like it's like it kind of feels like a Pirate of the Caribbean kind of scenario, and like Sarah's just fixed on this. And so Mark is all of a sudden asking, it's like, hey, where are all my friends? Like, it seems a little odd. And so both Mark and Sarah just decide that they are going to leave together. And so, like, yeah, they're just like, dude, we're getting out of here. So eventually Mark takes Sarah back to her home, and so like these guys are asked, like Mark is asking, like, okay, where are all my friends? And like these guys of course have no answer. They just say that, oh, they left for the night. And so Mark is like, I don't believe that whatsoever. So Mark is all of a sudden going and like trying to find his friends, like trying to see, like track down where they went. And so eventually he ends up even going to school, and he's just like, you know what, I can't find my friends. So like this is just really like, if I can't find them like by this afternoon, like I'm calling the cops. Like this is just not right. That all of a sudden they have gone missing. And so I'm like, good for you, Mark. You're like really working at this. Like a lot of people would have easily just been like, well, maybe they're sick or maybe they're whatever. And like 12 days later, like you still would have just been like, ah, well, like I guess they're just dead. Luckily I wasn't. So Mark is to eventually realize that his friends are just missing. And so he decides that he is going to go and speak to a detective. And so both Mark and this detective, who is Detective Inspector Rogers. Inspector Rogers is to eventually like want to talk with the wax workman, and so what ends up happening is Inspector Rogers does like go in here, like kind of sneaks in there and kind of takes a sample of somebody's like skin, and I guess tries to see if there's a DNA match with any like human remains of anyone, because supposedly there have been 13 people that have gone missing. So what eventually happens is Inspector Rogers eventually goes back into this waxworks to end up getting shoved into one of the pieces that the waxworksman went in with Inspector Rogers and looked at. Because the waxworkman was almost going to shove the inspector into one of these scenes, but eventually, like, didn't get really that far. So once the inspector gets back into this waxwork of a place, he ends up eventually getting shoved into this Egyptian scene where all of a sudden him, who is now this, I guess, archaeologist, is going and trying to open up this coffin. If it were me, I would have just been like, hey, how about we just leave the coffin just, closed? Like, dude, because here's the thing, like, this inspector needed to help this guy. I would have just said no. But no, like, the inspector and this guy just open up this coffin, which is an awful sign. And so that unleashes this mummy out to basically just kill all of these people. And so we have a woman with Inspector Rogers that ends up getting chucked into this coffin, and then we have Inspector Rogers that ends up getting chucked in the coffin as well. And then the mummy goes and seals the coffin upon those two people to, I guess, to just die, in this coffin. Like, die buried alive, basically, because how are they going to get this coffin off of them, I guess? So, pushing on. So, we eventually have Steven, who is to have been China's, I guess, quasi-boyfriend. It kind of feels like they feel like it's kind of fast and loose with who's like really like boyfriend girlfriend of who a lot through this movie. It just kind of feels like they like any of these women can end up with this with these guys, because script will kind of be loose with that. So anyways, so Steven is to eventually call China's parents and just be like, hey, where is China? And so the last time that her parents had heard anything from China, she had supposedly gone to a waxworks place. And so Steven is like, well, hey, give me the address for that. And so Steven goes and is to head into this waxworks as well. And for the life of me, I'm trying to remember what his scenario was, because it honestly was a forgettable one. Yeah, I don't remember what that one was at all, but I know like he eventually like I think what ends up happening to him is he gets like quickly put into there, and like he just becomes part of the wax museum. I don't even think that they really gave him a real true like legitimate story. I think that wasn't like quite long enough for it to actually matter, but like I could be wrong about that because like there's also like the last two people that end up getting pushed in here that I don't think have like a big enough story either. But it is what it is. Uh so what ends up happening is like the inspector ends up getting killed, and then the other inspector that was with Inspector Rogers ends up getting his neck just snapped, and so we have like the wax workers like, dude, we could have used him. So what ends up happening is Mark is to all of a sudden have this like euphoria of a moment to have remembered the wax worker, and he needs to go up to his father's work studies to eventually like figure out where this tying of this man is. And so all of a sudden Mark is to show us a newspaper of many years ago with a guy named Lincoln on it, and that is to be this wax worker guy. And so Mark is to head to a man, I believe, called Sir Wilfred, and so Mark is to head to him, and all of a sudden, this is like old guy with all the answers in this movie. It's like, oh, of course, we have to always have one person with all the answers in every movie, and this guy just has to be conveniently that person because we always have to have that in a movie, an old guy with all the answers. So Mark is to go on to talk to this man, and so this guy is to break down that evidently there is like 18 evil people in the world, and that eventually there have to be a number of people that this wax work needs to unleash its work upon everyone. Like basically it's kind of like a Goosebumps kind of a thing where it's like, hey, don't open the book. Like, well, if like a certain number of people all die in this waxwork, then that will basically open the book and unleash all of these things out onto the earth. And like they need to kill every single bit of these things making its way out, because like, or otherwise it's just gonna like cause like chaos and anarchy and like an apocalypse that no one wants. So Mark is just like, okay, great, like cool. So that means we're gonna have to forcibly go back to this waxwork to try and stop this from happening somehow. Sir Wilford is basically telling these people that they need to burn down this waxwork. I'm like, why didn't anybody come up with this earlier? Like, did they not know the waxwork like was there? Like, maybe it's one of those where like only a certain kind of people can see this, or maybe like this thing just kind of pops up randomly, and now that somebody had found it, it's like, okay, we need to go and find this and take this thing down, because it's just maybe a random thing that pops up from whatever location, which I think that would honestly be kind of cool if it kind of resets somehow. Like I'm kind of interested in actually watching the sequel of this movie, but who knows if anyone is actually interested in this film. So. But I actually liked it. It was kind of fun for me. I just thought it was an enjoyable scenario. So both Mark and Sarah are to make their way back into this place, and so all of a sudden we have the wax worker man, and we have like the lurch of a butler-ish like guy, basically just taking both of these people and like strong arming them and kind of chucking them into their scenarios to have to forcibly make them live within these things. So what ends up happening, which I think was kind of cool, Mark actually ends up in this like black and white zombie movie, which I was like, okay, this is great, this is cool. So we have Mark who's in this graveyard of these zombies, and so he's like fighting them off. And so eventually Mark is to easily make it out of his scenario because he's basically like he's pushed into this wall, but he ends up just deciding to just jump out of it, and he ends up just working his way out of the scene without a scratch on him to turn himself into a zombie or whatever. So Sarah is to be in her Pirates of the Caribbean kind of story, and so all of a sudden we have her who is to supposedly continuing to get like basically strapped and get like whipped repetitiously. And so every time supposedly this woman is to get whipped, she's to have this kind of like kind of moment that seems just kind of weird. I guess as if this girl is to get pleased or whatever, to the point of her just like hit me more kind of thing. Like put some steak on it. Like I'm just like, okay, that's kind of weird. So all of a sudden, Mark is to make it out of his scenario, and so he decides to go and help Sarah get out of hers. So Mark is to tell Sarah, like, hey, like, you need to think that you are not going to die, and you won't. So, because Mark ends up handing this pirate of a man who is actually Marques de Sede. I'm butchering that name, I know I am, but he's like the pirate of this story. And so we have Mark who hands Marquess this gun and says, like, shoot me, go ahead. And so this guy, of course, does, and Mark does not die. So it's like, oh, okay, so like if you're not afraid, it can't hurt you, kind of thing. That's the real scenario that we're getting here. Is like if you're not afraid of any of this, it can't kill you, it can't hurt you, it can't whatever. And so like I think that kind of approach to this would have been really cool, that everybody would have had to eventually face all of their fears and probably made it out of this, and eventually they just would have eventually had to forcibly find like X amount of other dumb people that didn't know any better, and then killed all of them off quickly and whatever. But anyways, so but pushing on, because like the whole concept of this was freaking amazing. I wish eventually that they would go, if there's a real solid budget to do this again, like just remake it. Like that would be pretty sweet. But anyways, so going into this, so Mark is to try to like unchain Sarah. And all of a sudden, she's to like grab the leg of her pirate-esh man and just be like, "No, I'm not leaving him. Like I'm not leaving here. Like it seems like she just wants to be whipped bizarrely." And so, but Mark has to eventually convince Sarah that they need to leave, and then Sarah convinces herself that they need to leave, and so both of them come back out of this, and so all of a sudden you have the Waxworkman who's just like clapping, like slow clapping, and he's just like, yeah, like bravo for you, you guys did it, but like that doesn't matter because all we need is 2 more people, and luckily enough there is going to be 2 more people coming. And so these 2 like kind of like ignorant people all of a sudden go in here, and we just immediately like see like both of them end up eventually as part of these like scenarios, because eventually what ends up happening when someone is to eventually die, they are to be a part or a piece of any thing of this like set piece, because eventually once everything like just like becomes alive again, that all of these people eventually come off to be villains and try to kill everyone, and it's crazy. So these 2 characters are to die, and so all of a sudden we are starting to see every bit of these wax things coming back to life. And so now we have basically anarchy just like busting loose because all of a sudden we have the Sir Wilfrid and all of these like Jenkins, who is like Mark's butler, and just all of these like people that are just like, heck yeah, like I'm hillbilly with a pitchfork and I'm not gonna let any of these things like come and ruin my town. And so all of a sudden everybody in town is like, yeah, we're gonna take this place down. And so we just all of a sudden have this huge war going on. Like there's werewolves killing people, crushing their heads, ripping off their heads. Murder ensued. This baby vampire thing is attacking people, grabbing their legs. Alien guy is being like chopped in the head, and all kinds of craziness. Things are going everywhere, and so eventually Mark is to bump into some of the women that had previously been women that eventually did die. Eventually, we have a moment where Mark is to be seduced by China, who all of a sudden is to be a vampire, and so all of a sudden we have Sarah, who ends up going and killing China because Mark was almost seduced by China. And so, like, really we get this kind of like back and forth thing of like everybody trying to tear down and take down all these like monsters and whatever, which leads us to eventually have Mark having to sword fight that pirate, which he has now like this black bandana on, and to showcase that he's like the pirate of this scenario. So Mark is to kind of like try to sword fight this guy, but Mark like sadly does not have the skills to pay the bills, sadly enough. There's a lot of times where this guy just gets disarmed consistently, and eventually Mark is to seemingly going to just be like, yeah, you're gonna die soon. You're gonna die there, buddy, sadly enough. So before the pirate is to go and stab Mark, we all of a sudden have an axe in this pirate's back, coming from, of course, this girl. And or no, wait. Yeah, coming from this girl. And so all of a sudden we have like Sir Wilfrid, who is to go and save both Sarah and Mark, because like the Waxwork man, the Lincoln, all of a sudden is to have this bizarre alien of a gun to point at them. And so Sir Wilfrid is going and shooting the Waxwork man. He all of a sudden falls in this big thing of wax, and then he like comes up again for one last scare, but then eventually he goes back down. So Wilfrid is like, dude, you guys gotta get out of here, because if anything, this place is on fire. So figure out like some way to get freaking out of here, because like, yeah, like everybody's gonna die. Like we have like the werewolf that all of a sudden is behind Sir Wilfrid, ripping his head off and killing him. And so yeah, like supposedly this whole place supposedly burns down to a crisp, but supposedly there is one hand that is to make its way out of here, which eventually gets stabbed via the sword. It's just like, no, like nothing's getting out of here. We want to make sure. But like, I'm sure eventually something is going to probably seep out or something or whatever. Like, that's where probably an end credit scene would really play into, like, yeah, we're doing another one, because I know there's a sequel of this. So it would be kind of interesting to see how that plays out. Because I'm sure it's probably just one of those where it's like this thing is just going to continue to pop up every so often. And yeah, it would be kind of cool to see the sequel. Maybe Mark and like, maybe at least Mark is probably in the sequel, I'm assuming or assessing, but I don't know. So with that said, yeah, I am gonna get out of here. I think there might have been like little bits of details that I probably just skipped around about. But yeah, but with that said, I think I also want to like call this one a wrap. So more than likely, there might be something that pops up into my brain that I might be like, oh, like I forgot to mention. Like I think there was that one spot where Mark was trying to drag Sarah out of like the lecture of her like teacher, and he was like, "Oh my God, teacher, I'm sick, but also I think Sarah is sick. Like we need to leave together." And so this teacher is like, "Okay, Mark, like go ahead and leave." And so like both of them are to like leave this class, and because eventually they need to go and like burn away this waxwork, and eventually they do, but like it kind of burns purely by accident. Uh, Instead of actually the purposely like, yeah, we're gonna burn this place down. No, like it like burns down like via the whole war that is being ensued. So, but yeah, so with that said, in a roundabout way, I review this movie. But I enjoyed this film. Go out of your way to say that you've seen it. But I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.